If you ever find yourself working the graveyard shift at a private pathology lab and a courier drops a cooler marked only with a red Sector 4 sticker, do not open the latches. Just walk into the break room, make a pot of coffee, and wait for the sun to come up. Because the things inside those vials don't follow the laws of biology, and once you've smelled the rotting honey, once that scent crawls into your sinuses and settles behind your eyes, you've already been marked as part of the census. I've spent 12 years looking at human blood under a microscope, and I'm telling you now, if the fluid in the tube starts to vibrate at a frequency you can feel in the roots of your teeth, it's already too late. My name is Elias, and for over a decade my life has been a repetitive loop of cold fluorescent lights and medical billing codes. I'm a senior hematologist at Cascade BioCore, a private pathology facility tucked into an industrial park off exit 47, the kind of place you drive past every day without ever noticing exists. We're wedged between a UPS distribution center and a shuttered textile factory. There's no sign on the building, just a number, 2193. I'm a rational person. I don't believe in legends. I believe in white blood cell counts, hemoglobin saturation curves, and platelet aggregation rates. My job is soul-crushing and clinical, exactly the kind of mundane routine that makes you feel like a ghost before you're actually dead. I centrifuge samples. I prepare slides. I stare through a microscope at cells that all bleed together after the third hour of a 12-hour shift. I eat vending machine sandwiches that taste like cardboard and mayonnaise. I drive home in silence, shower in silence, and sleep in silence. Then I do it all over again. The night shift pays 18% more than days. That's the only reason I'm here when the rest of the world is asleep. Cascade BioCore handles what they call private governmental contracts. We process samples for agencies that don't advertise their work. They tell us the blood comes from agricultural accidents, farm workers who got caught in machinery, pesticide exposure cases, livestock contamination studies. Sometimes they say it's high-altitude trauma from climbers in the national forests, people who pushed too far into the backcountry and paid for it with frostbite or hypoxia. I believed that story for 9 years. I played the part of the good employee. I documented the math of the human body because the math made me feel in control. Erythrocyte sedimentation rate, 0 to 22 millimeters per hour. Normal platelet count, 150,000 to 400,000 per microliter. Hematocrit levels for adult males, 38.3% to 48.6%. These numbers were my gospel. They were clean. They were predictable. They didn't ask questions, and neither did I. You learn pretty quickly in this line of work that curiosity is a liability. The samples come in labeled with alphanumeric codes, never names, patient 4A7, subject 22 kilo, source redacted. We log them into the system, run the panels, file the reports, and forget about them by morning. That's the job. That's the deal you make when you sign an NDA thicker than a phone book and agree to let your career disappear into a bureaucratic black hole. But here's the thing about working the graveyard shift in a lab where nobody asks questions. You start noticing patterns that don't belong in the data. You start seeing anomalies that your brain tries to rationalize away because the alternative is admitting that the foundation of your entire profession, the idea that human biology operates within fixed, measurable parameters, is a lie. It starts small, a sample that clots too fast, a platelet count that's triple the upper threshold, but the subject is still alive according to the metadata. Red blood cells that look slightly elongated under the scope, like something stretched them. You write it off as equipment malfunction, you recalibrate the centrifuge, you run the test again. And when the results come back identical, you do what you're trained to do. You document the anomaly in the comment section, submit the report, and move on to the next vial. Because if you stop and actually think about what you're looking at, if you let yourself wonder why a blood sample drawn from a hiking accident victim contains erythrocytes that appear to be dividing, outside the bone marrow, something that shouldn't be biologically possible, you'll drive yourself insane. So you don't think about it. You make your coffee. You eat your terrible sandwich. You stare at your phone during your 15-minute break and scroll through posts from people living real lives in the daylight, and you tell yourself that the math still works, even when, deep down, you know it doesn't. Tuesday at 3:14 a.m. I know the exact time because I was looking at the wall clock when the second hand stopped moving, just froze mid-tick between the 2 and the 3. I stared at it for a full 30 seconds, waiting for it to lurch forward, but it didn't. The digital readout on my workstation still flickered. 3:14, 3:14, 3:14, but that analog clock on the wall had given up entirely. It started with the silence. In a lab, there is always a baseline hum. It's the white noise of institutional function. Centrifuges spinning at 3,000 RPM, HVAC fans pulling stale air through steel ducts, The rhythmic beep of the automated cell counters, the low electronic whine of the refrigeration units keeping samples at exactly 4 degrees Celsius. You don't notice it until it stops, and when it stops, the absence is so profound, it feels like the building is holding its breath. But this wasn't just quiet, the silence became heavy. It had weight. It pressed against my eardrums like I'd descended too fast on an airplane. It felt like a barometric drop right before a tornado touches down. That primal pressure change that makes dogs howl and birds go silent. My jaw ached. My sinuses throbbed. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered twice, dimmed to a sickly amber, then struggled back to their normal cold glare. The air grew aggressive and cold, not the kind of cold you get from an air conditioner working too hard, but the kind of artificial chill you only get in places that don't want you to be comfortable. It was the cold of a morgue, the cold of a walk-in freezer where they store things that aren't supposed to rot. My breath didn't fog, but I could feel the temperature drop crawling across my skin, tightening the muscles in my neck and shoulders. I looked up from my station toward the intake corridor. A courier was standing at the gurney. I hadn't heard the security door buzz. I hadn't heard footsteps in the hallway. He was just there, perfectly still, like he'd materialized out of the static pressure in the room. He was wearing a cheap, off-the-rack suit, charcoal gray, ill-fitting, the kind you buy at a department store clearance rack because you need something forgettable. No company logo on the jacket, no ID badge clipped to his belt, no courier bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't blink. I'm not exaggerating. I watched him for a solid 15 seconds, and his eyelids never moved. His chest didn't rise or fall. He didn't shift his weight from one foot to the other. He didn't check his phone or glance at his watch or do any of the small unconscious movements that living people do when they're standing still and waiting. He just stood there, staring at nothing, tapping a manila envelope against the metal rail of the gurney. Tap, 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 tap. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. The sound echoed in the silence like a drumbeat in an empty cathedral. Each tap sent a tiny jolt of adrenaline through my nervous system, the kind of primal alarm that tells you something is wrong, even if you can't articulate what it is. I cleared my throat. "Can I help you?" My voice sounded thin and distant, like I was speaking through a layer of gauze. He didn't respond, didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge me at all. He just kept tapping. Tap, tap, tap. I stood up from my stool, my lab coat rustling too loud in the unnatural quiet, and took 3 steps toward the intake window. My hand hovered over the intercom button, but I didn't press it, because that's when I saw the cooler sitting on the gurney beside him. It was standard medical transport, white molded plastic, biohazard rating, reinforced steel latches, but across the top in red vinyl was a sticker I'd never seen before. No barcode, no alphanumeric tracking code, no facility stamp, just 2 words printed in block letters. Open the first vial from Sector 4. Standard protocol, gloves, face shield, biosafety cabinet with negative airflow. I twisted the cap counterclockwise, heard the pneumatic hiss of the vacuum seal breaking, and that's when the scent hit me. It wasn't gradual, it didn't waft up gently from the tube. It hit me, a physical blow to the sternum that made me stumble backward half a step, my hip colliding with the edge of the workstation. For a second, I thought I was having a cardiac event. My chest tightened, my throat closed, my eyes watered involuntarily. It wasn't the metallic tang of human blood, that sharp, iron-rich smell I've encountered 10,000 times in my career. This was something else entirely. It was a thick, cloying sweetness like honey that had been sitting in a sealed mason jar with something dead for a month. Floral, but wrong. Sweet, but rancid. The kind of smell that coats the inside of your nostrils and refuses to leave, even after you've stepped away from the source. I've smelled decomposition before. I've opened containers of hemolyzed samples that had been left out of refrigeration too long. This wasn't that. This was deliberate. This was a smell that felt design. I forced myself back to the biosafety cabinet, mouth breathing through clenched teeth, and pipetted a single drop onto a glass slide. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was the cold air. I told myself it was fatigue from the long shift. I placed the cover slip, loaded the slide onto the stage, and adjusted the objective lens to 400x magnification. What I saw made my brain refuse to file the geometry. Human erythrocytes are biconcave discs. They're smooth, uniform, predictable. Under a microscope, they look like little red donuts without holes, floating in a pale yellow plasma matrix. You can identify them in your sleep after enough years in the field. These weren't. The cells were elongated, stretched into irregular ovoid shapes, some of them almost tubular. They looked like someone had taken normal red blood cells and pulled them through a sieve. But worse than the shape was the movement. Blood cells don't move on their own. They drift passively in Brownian motion, nudged around by molecular collisions. They don't have flagella. They don't have cilia. They don't have motors. These cells were moving with methodical purpose. I watched, paralyzed, as a cluster of erythrocytes rotated 90 degrees in unison, snapped into a new configuration like Tetris blocks locking into place, then realigned themselves into a geometric lattice. It wasn't random, it wasn't chaos, it was organized. The cells were communicating, they were coordinating, they were building something. This wasn't a biological miracle. This wasn't some rare genetic mutation or exotic infectious agent. This was an operating system being harvested. I pulled back from the eyepiece, my pulse hammering in my ears, and forced myself to do what I was trained to do: document. I opened the digital logging interface and started entering data points, my fingers stumbling over the keyboard. Caloric density, off the scale. The spectrophotometer reading showed an energy signature 3 times higher than normal human blood. These cells were burning fuel at an impossible rate. Thermal spikes, localized temperature fluctuations within the sample, hot spots blooming and fading in irregular patterns across the slide. I recalibrated the thermal sensor twice. The readings didn't change, and then I made the mistake of exposing the sample to ultraviolet light. Standard procedure for certain pathogen detection protocols. You hit the sample with UVC at 254 nanometers and watch for fluorescence. Bacteria light up. Certain viruses glow. It's routine. The fluid on the slide didn't glow. It unzipped. I don't have another word for it. The plasma matrix separated along invisible seams, peeling apart like a zipper opening, and beneath the surface layer I could see something else. Fine, thread-like structures, impossibly thin, branching and rebranching in fractal patterns. They pulsed, they reached, and then all at once, the sample went completely still. The cells stopped moving, the threads retracted, the thermal spikes flatlined. It was like the sample realized it was being watched. That's when I saw the retrieval team on the security feed. I wasn't supposed to be looking at the monitors. The security station is technically off-limits to lab personnel. It's a separate wing, access-controlled, manned by contract guards who rotate every 6 weeks and never make eye contact. But the courier who delivered the Sector 4 cooler had left the intake corridor door propped open with a rubber wedge, and from my workstation, I had a direct sightline to the bank of black and white, screens mounted on the far wall. At first, I thought the feed was malfunctioning. The images were flickering, stuttering, like a corrupted video file struggling to buffer. But then I realized the stutter wasn't digital. It was them. They were moving so fast that the 30 frames per second refresh rate of the cameras couldn't capture them cleanly. They appeared as tall, sleek silhouettes, elongated and impossibly thin. Their limbs too long, their joints bending at angles that made my stomach turn. Their skin. God, their skin. It wasn't pale in the way human skin is pale. It was the color of dirty ice, that grayish-white translucence you see on a frozen lake in late winter when the thaw is starting and the structural integrity is compromised. I could see the network of veins beneath the surface, dark blue tracery pulsing with something that moved too quickly to be normal circulation. They weren't doctors. They weren't wearing hazmat suits or scrubs or any kind of protective equipment. They were dressed in tailored black clothing that looked vaguely medical, high collars, long sleeves, fitted trousers, but there were no logos, no name tags, no hospital identification. They moved through the hallway adjacent to the main lab with a velocity that defied human anatomy, their strides covering 12-15 feet at a time without appearing to run. They glided. It was the only word my brain could supply. They glided like figures in a dream sequence, untethered from gravity and momentum. I counted 4 of them, maybe 5. It was hard to tell because they kept phasing in and out of the camera's focal range, appearing in one frame at the far end of the corridor and materializing 3 doorways down in the next. They were wheeling something. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing because my brain kept trying to recategorize it as medical equipment, a gurney, a transport pod, some kind of industrial refrigeration unit. But then the cameras caught a clear angle, and I saw it for what it was. A creature? Massive, fur-covered, strapped to a reinforced surgical table with steel restraints that looked like they belonged in a maximum security prison. Its limbs were grotesquely elongated, the musculature overdeveloped to the point of deformity. The hands, or paws, or whatever you'd call them, were tipped with claws that had gouged deep scratches into the stainless steel table beneath it. The head was canine, wolf-like, but the skull was too large, the jaw too pronounced, the teeth too long and too sharp and too human in their alignment. A werewolf. or what the internal documentation I'd seen in misfiled reports called an alpha mutant. I'd always assumed those references were code for something else: experimental test subjects, genetic anomalies, agricultural hybrid specimens. I'd assumed the terminology was bureaucratic obfuscation, the kind of language agencies use when they don't want to say classified weapons research or illegal human trials. I'd been wrong, but here's the thing that broke my brain. The thing that made me grip the edge of the workstation so hard my knuckles went white. The Alpha wasn't the predator here. It was whimpering. I couldn't hear it through the security feed, but I could see its muzzle moving, its lips pulled back in a rictus of pain, its massive chest heaving in shallow, rapid breaths. Its eyes, yellow, slitted, wet with something that looked unnervingly like tears, tracked the movements of the retrieval team with the desperate, pleading awareness of a creature that knows exactly what's about to happen and can't do anything to stop it. One of the pale figures leaned over the table. Its hands moved with inhuman precision, fingers elongating, the tips sharpening into something that wasn't quite scalpel and wasn't quite claw. I watched as it opened the Alpha's ribcage with a single smooth incision, spreading the bones apart like opening a cabinet door. There was no blood spray, no thrashing. The Alpha just convulsed once, its entire body going rigid, and then went horribly, unnaturally still. They were operating on it while it was conscious. The figure reached into the chest cavity, no gloves, no hesitation, and began extracting the spine. Not cutting it, not sawing through vertebrae, extracting it, pulling it out in one continuous piece like a pin being removed from a grenade, the entire spinal column sliding free with surgical precision. The Alpha's body spasmed. Its claws scraped against the table. Its jaw opened in what I can only assume was a silent scream. And then I understood. The vampires. Because that's what they were. That's the only framework my collapsing sanity could supply. They weren't hunting us. They weren't lurking in the shadows waiting to drain unsuspecting victims in back alleys. They weren't the apex predators of myth and folklore. They were managing the livestock. This facility, Cascade Biocore, the samples marked Sector 4, the private governmental contracts, the NDAs, the couriers who didn't blink, the reports that never reached the public, it wasn't a cover-up. It was infrastructure. It was logistics. This was a harvesting operation. We, humans, the ones who thought we were at the top of the food chain, the ones who built cities and wrote laws and convinced ourselves we'd conquered nature, we were just one tier in a hierarchy that operated on a completely different axis. And the monsters we told stories about around campfires, the werewolves and cryptids and things that went bump in the night, they weren't the apex either. They were the grass, we were all the grass, and the things with dirty ice skin and too long fingers and movements too fast for cameras to capture. They were the ones with the scythes. They were the ones who decided when the harvest came. They were the ones who'd built the infrastructure to keep the crops healthy and compliant and ignorant, right up until the moment the extraction began. The Alpha's body went limp on the table. The retrieval team placed the spine, still glistening, still pulsing, into a cylindrical container filled with fluid that glowed faintly under the hallway's fluorescent lights. And then, as smoothly as they'd arrived, they wheeled the table back down the corridor and disappeared from the security feed entirely. The cameras flickered once, then returned to normal, like nothing had happened at all. I found the ledger in the back of the lab. It wasn't filed with the usual documentation. It wasn't on the shared server or locked in the records room with the rest of the administrative materials. It was tucked into a steel cabinet in the storage annex, the room where we keep outdated equipment and decommissioned centrifuges. The cabinet wasn't labeled. There was no inventory sticker, just a plain gray door with a magnetic lock that for some reason opened when I pressed my palm against the sensor. Inside was a single black binder, the kind with reinforced metal rings and laminated dividers. The cover had no title, no classification marking, just a barcode that didn't correspond to any system I recognized. I opened it. It wasn't a list of patients. It wasn't a research log or a safety protocol document. It was a filing system of human husks. Each page was dedicated to a single individual: name, age, height, weight, blood type. But beneath the basic demographic information was something else entirely: detailed behavioral analysis, speech cadence metrics, preferred sentence structure, gestural tics, how many times per hour they touched their face, whether they favored their left or right hand when reaching for objects, the exact angle of their head tilt when they were confused, dietary preferences down to the brand of coffee they drank, sleep cycle disruptions, psychological triggers, trauma history, sexual patterns, everything. It was a manual, a user guide for wearing a human being. I flipped through the pages with trembling hands, my breath coming in shallow gasps, until I reached the section marked Active Contracts. And that's when I saw my own face staring back at me from a laminated ID photo I didn't remember taking. Subject: Elias Brennan. Assignment duration: 1,847 days, 5.1 years. Status: replacement cycle initiated. Below that, paragraphs of text documenting me. My voice drops half an octave when I'm tired. I tap my pen exactly 3 times against the desk before writing a report. I drink black coffee, 2 cups per shift, never 3. I check my phone during breaks, but rarely respond to messages. I bite the inside of my cheek when I'm thinking. I avoid eye contact in conversations that make me uncomfortable. Someone had been watching me, studying me, learning me. For 5 years, I stood there, frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears, and that's when I noticed the storage closet adjacent to the cabinet. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible in the gap. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew I shouldn't have opened it, but my hand moved anyway, fingers closing around the handle, pulling the door wide. The closet wasn't deep, maybe 3 feet. Hanging from a reinforced steel rod like suits in a dry cleaner's shop were the skins. I reached out, my hand shaking, and touched the nearest one. It felt flat, sickeningly vacant, like touching a deflated balloon made of something that had once been alive. The texture was wrong, too smooth, too uniform, too perfect. It was a meat suit designed to navigate the daylight. A flawless replica of a human being, folded and stored away like a shed snakeskin waiting for its next occupant. I stumbled backward, my shoulder hitting the cabinet, and the binder fell to the floor. The pages splayed open to the last entry, my entry, and at the bottom, in neat clinical handwriting, replacement, deployed, integration, 97% complete, original, scheduled for processing. That's when I heard them, footsteps in the hallway, not the frantic scramble of someone running. Not the casual shuffle of a janitor making rounds. These were rhythmic, methodical, deliberate. A slow, measured thud, thud, thud that echoed off the tile floor and reverberated through the walls. They were getting closer. I backed toward the far corner of the storage room, my eyes locked on the doorway. My breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat, and then I heard it. My own voice, drifting through the ventilation grate above my head, smooth and calm and perfectly inflected, exactly the way I sound when I'm trying to reassure someone after a long shift. 2 words spoken softly, like a greeting to an old friend. Welcome home.